latest book, Blind Over Cuba, The Photo Gap and the Missile Crisis, challenges the popular perception of that half-century-old affair as an unqualified foreign policy triumph of the Kennedy administration, and explores the severe tension present at the time between the administration and the intelligence community that actually hampered a coherent effort to address the imminent Soviet threat and wantonly put the country at risk. Please welcome Dr. David Barrett.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for being here. I'm a tall guy. Can you hear me pretty well? Okay, great. So thank you for being here. I'm very honored by your presence. So the book that I worked on came to be known as Blind Over Cuba, The Photo Gap and the Missile Crisis. And let me say right off at the start, there's a co-author. I know for the next half hour or so I'm going to be talking about this as if I did this thing. The fact is, there's a very crucial co-author by the name of Max Holland who lives in Washington, D.C. Max is a very fine scholar, and this, I believe, is my fourth book, and I think it's his fourth book as well. And he is working on a book on the Warren Commission, a political history of the Warren Commission, which looked into the Kennedy assassination. And when that book comes out, a bit down the road, I think will be the classic work on that topic. But our topic, Max and I met at an archive. I spend a lot of time at archives, so does he, and usually I'm just so busy at archives, I barely chat with anyone. I'm just so obsessed with going through boxes and folders. So I actually did chat with this other person. We discovered we had a lot of research interest in common. So what's the photo gap topic? It might help for me to say, first of all, what the book is not about. Our book is not about the so-called 13 days period, the intense crisis period, the most critical period of the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. And by the way, both Max and I agree with the conventional wisdom that President Kennedy acted it seems to us, in a very skillful and wise fashion during the most intense period of the crisis itself, which is the Soviets had secretly placed missiles into Cuba. They began this process. The deployment was actually happening late summer, early fall. And when, at a certain point, President Kennedy was informed that the Soviets were doing this, missiles that could hit the U.S. with warheads, nuclear warheads, he used a combination of diplomacy and gathering military force to persuade the Soviet leader, Khrushchev, to agree to pull those missiles and warheads out of Cuba. Our book is particularly interested in the lead-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We became aware of this thing. Max especially first discovered this of what I'll define for you as the photo gap. And we're very interested in the aftermath of the so-called 13 days period, when there was a congressional investigation into the performance of the intelligence agencies in the lead-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, let me review a bit of history for you. Here you see a very cheery photo of John F. Kennedy and Allen Dulles. This is actually at a point where John F. Kennedy had been nominated by the Democrats for the presidency, and the practice is that the Director of Central Intelligence, as that title was then known, briefs the candidate on what is it that U.S. intelligence knows about so-called hotspots around the world. What was underway was a plan to try to overthrow Castro in Cuba. That was the Bay of Pigs incident, which I'll assume you have some familiarity with. The short version of it, though, is that under the first guidance of President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy, CIA organized Cuban exiles here in the exiles who were primarily here to go into Cuba to try to overthrow Fidel Castro's government. That was in April 1961, just a few months into Kennedy's presidency. It failed spectacularly and miserably and publicly. And President Kennedy, as he said privately afterwards, how could I have been so stupid? So it's fair to say he was angry at himself, disappointed in himself. He was also angry and disappointed in this man, Allen Dulles. Dulles had served President Eisenhower as director of Central Intelligence for 8 years. Now he was serving Kennedy. Kennedy was most unhappy with the CIA and Dulles in particular, for urging him on with his Bay of Pigs project, which failed so badly. Kennedy was also unhappy with the State Department and the military leadership, and on and on and on. Here is a Life magazine cover. It was this magazine issue was some months or a couple of years after Bay of Pigs, but and here I like this editorial cartoon. Oops. Kennedy, it shows Kennedy with a Cuban cigar in his mouth, which has just exploded. It was only a matter of time before Allen Dulles would be out as director. Kennedy had to decide whom to choose. He caught a good deal of criticism from many Republicans and some Democrats about Bay of Pigs for not giving sufficient air support to that Bay of Pigs intervention. And so many people blamed, not CIA, many people in this country blamed President Kennedy for the failure of Bay of Pigs. So he was catching a lot of political heat from especially conservatives in this country. He made a political choice in terms of his next director. The man you see there on the right, John McCain, a Republican, a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, conservative, hawkish, anti-communist, close to former President Eisenhower. He had served in Eisenhower's administration. He had also served under Truman, but again, McCain had a very conservative and again, Republican identification. So this was very much a political choice on the part of President Kennedy. Now also, McCain, although having had no background specifically in intelligence, had a good reputation for being smart, assertive, a good manager, and so Kennedy made that choice. Okay, let me cover a lot of history very briefly. The U.S. had continuing concerns about Cuba beyond Bay of Pigs. One of the things that kept coming up sort of in the rumor mill in the rest of 1961 and the first half of 1962 is that the Soviets were placing missiles into Cuba, which could hit the U.S., nuclear-armed missiles. This man, of all the people in the country raising this claim, Senator Kenneth Keating, a Republican of New York State. This man, how many here know about Kenneth Keating? I think he's pretty well forgotten. I'm getting like 3 hands in the whole audience. 4, okay, 5, great. But most of you don't know this guy. He, for a while there, in 1962 and a year or so beyond, this guy's name was a household word because especially in August, September, the first half of October 1962, Keating would go onto the floor of the Senate and say, I have talked to intelligence personnel, and they have told me that the Soviets are deploying medium and intermediate range missiles into Cuba with nuclear warheads. And I know that these intelligence people have given this information to the president. So why aren't they doing anything? Why is the president doing nothing? The White House, again, August, September, October 1962, the White House would issue statements. President Kennedy himself would say in press conferences, I've heard no such thing. The president admitted, yes, we know the Soviets have put surface-to-air missiles in Cuba. A surface-to-air missile, well, it's what it sounds like. It's on the land surface. It goes up into the air. It can shoot down incoming aircraft. And the president said, yeah, we know about some of those. We're monitoring the situation, but that's it. But Keating said, Keating and others, but especially Keating, he's the one who got the publicity. He had a flair for publicity. Something's going on. Well, let's go back to McCain, though. Inside Kennedy administration circles and at the CIA itself, McCain also believed, August, September, October 1962, he believed that the Soviets were putting missiles, nuclear-armed missiles into Cuba that could strike the U.S. Almost no one in the Kennedy administration thought that. at CIA and elsewhere, they were confident. The Soviets wouldn't do that. It's too reckless. It's too provocative. The intelligence establishment, not just CIA, but CIA with the other intelligence agencies' consultations, actually did a formal estimate issued in September, I think it's September 19th, 1962, and it said, yeah, the Soviets, they could do that, but what we think is they wouldn't. So there was a real confidence on the part of President Kennedy and most people in the administration and in the intelligence community, the Soviets wouldn't do that. So the mavericks in all of this are McCain. McCain was just acting on logic. He said, why are the Soviets are putting surface-to-air missiles? What are they defending? What are they defending? What's going on there? But he didn't know. It was his, as he later said, his intuition. So McCain inside the administration, Keating outside the administration. Okay, well you might think that there would be very aggressive surveillance of Cuba. So let me tell you what had been going on. Throughout, so this goes back to late 1961, and certainly throughout the first, say, 8 months or so of 1962, the U.S. sent U-2 aircraft over the length of Cuba twice per month. The U-2 aircraft, you might be aware, was and is a very high-flying aircraft. It was without weapons, not really a military aircraft. It's a spy aircraft, and we had used it in the latter half of the 1950s. There was a famous U-2 incident where one of the ones we sent over to the Soviet Union was shot down and really disrupted U.S.-Soviet relations. Remember, it's a violation of international law. If you're sending an aircraft across another country, there's a problem there. And so when the Soviets shot this down, there was a problem between the two nations. So, 2 U-2 flights over the length of Cuba, east to west, or west, I think west to east typically, or back and forth, but 2 per month. All right, so right at the very time where there are growing suspicions about what the Soviets were doing, there were 2, let's say, smaller U-2 incidents around the world. One is a U-2, late summer 1962, wandered accidentally across a portion of the Soviet Union, briefly. But you know, this is worrisome to the president and to the State Department. And we had supplied the Republic of China, Taiwan, with U-2s to fly over the People's Republic of China. One of those got shot down also, late summer 1962. So suddenly we've had these 2 U-2 incidents. They were not utterly disruptive of ongoing relations, but they were problematic. So what happened is, when the CIA people requested the usual 2 flights across Cuba in early September 1962, they were told no. There was a very crucial meeting, and the Secretary of State said, well, it's too dangerous. How about if you just fly some U-2s, sort of peripheral flights over the water close to Cuba, like do that. How about 4 of those? And you might think, well, surely this John McCain, I didn't really say much to you about him, a real hard-charging guy, tough as nails. And you would think, well, surely this guy, given his suspicions, he would say, oh no, we have to have our U-2 flights over Cuba. You know why he didn't? Because he was on his honeymoon. He had remarried. His first wife had died. He remarried. And guess how long his honeymoon was? 1 month. Basically, for roughly the month of September, he was in the south of France. He was on a honeymoon. The guy he left in charge at CIA was a pretty capable guy, I would say, but rather ineffectual. So the ineffectual guy, the deputy director, when he goes to this meeting in early September, the Secretary of State says, well, no, let's not. And he's backed up by the President's National Security Advisor who says, no, let's not. Let's do these peripheral flights around the edge of Cuba. The guy kind of caves, and McCain on his honeymoon, John McCain, he didn't know that. Ironically, McCain was sending cables on his honeymoon back to the CIA itself saying, now don't forget, I think there's something going on in Cuba, like don't forget. He never sent any such a message to the White House during this honeymoon, but he was sending him to the CIA. In any case, he was really sort of out of, I always wonder, like, okay, I understand, you got married, you want a honeymoon. How about 10 days, as opposed to a month? But it was a month. So, John McCone comes back, I don't know, about the 4th or so of October. He has shown a graphic representation of where the flights have gone and not gone over Cuba. And what he sees is, for the last, by that point, it's the last U-2 flight had been September 5th. Basically, the photo gap is this: from September 5th until October 14th, 5.5 weeks, no U-2 flights over Cuba. At the very time where Senator Keating is warning missiles in Cuba, McCone is thinking missiles, nuclear armed in Cuba, no flights. Well, anyway, so McCone gets back for the month's honeymoon. Now we're into early October. He really doesn't understand what's happened somehow, and yet finally he's shown a graphic representation of where the U-2s have gone and not gone. And he sees they've gone around Cuba, they haven't gone over Cuba for over 5 weeks. And he really like jumped out of his chair and said, "Give me that." He took it to the White House, he showed it to President Kennedy, and said, "Now I'm your director of Central Intelligence. I cannot assure you that there are no Soviet missiles, so-called strategic missiles, which could reach the U.S. I cannot assure you that there are not nuclear-armed strategic missiles. If you're not going to let us send the U-2 over Cuba." So reluctantly, the president gave in. He approved one flight, and not even over the length of Cuba. The basic deal was, okay, you intelligence fellows, you figure out where you think, where's the missile problem? And the greatest concern was for the sort of the western third or so of Cuba. So we sent one sort of like here on October 14th, 1962. On the 15th, the photo interpreters looked at the photographic take. They weren't just seeing surface-to-air missiles anymore. I mean, they saw this. They saw medium-range missile sites. And they so reported that. And so the next morning, on the 16th of October, President Kennedy, Kennedy had gotten out of bed, taken a shower, was in a robe, and his national security advisor walked in and told him what had been discovered. He responded with a certain 4-letter word that I won't repeat here. And then he also said, because the U.S. government had been receiving assurances from Khrushchev, from the Soviet government, that they were not going to do that. The Soviets, Khrushchev had even put it in political terms. Look, we're not going to do anything to upset. I forgot to say, there's a congressional election coming in early November 1962. Khrushchev has said, we're not going to do anything to affect that. So Kennedy, but the second thing Kennedy said is, he can't do this to me, meaning Khrushchev. So Keating got the details wrong, but in the larger sense, he was right. President Kennedy really hated that. McCone had been right as well. But what was not publicized then and for decades afterward was that there had been this photo gap, 5.5 weeks of not surveilling Cuba. As you know, the so-called 13 days period honestly, it turned out quite well. That is, the U.S. secured the goal of getting the Soviets to pull their strategic missiles with associated warheads, although the warheads were actually lagging behind on the shipping. So the medium-range missiles were just becoming operational in this very time frame period. The intermediate-range missiles would have become operational some weeks down the road. In any case, the U.S. secured its goal of getting the Soviets to pull the strategic missiles and warheads out of there. The U.S. publicly agreed that we would not invade Cuba. Now, there was some loopholes in that, which I won't go into, but that was the public agreement. That was the public concession of the U.S. Soviets pull out missiles and warheads. The U.S. says it won't invade Cuba. In other words, the U.S. would not do another Bay of Pigs or some bigger version of that. Privately, the president agreed that we would pull our missiles. We had missiles in Turkey and Italy, nuclear armed, which we did in the Soviet Union. Privately, President Kennedy agreed, okay, we'll pull those out. So there was a trade that occurred, but part of that part of the story was kept secret from the Congress, the public, and all that. But overall, you saw the Life magazine, or the editorial cartoon showing Kennedy, oops, and the exploding cigar. I'm sure if I looked, I could have found an editorial cartoon of Kennedy. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it seems to me, justifiably in many ways, is considered a great triumph for President Kennedy. And I think it's because of his skill in sort of managing this this crisis. It really could have led to a nuclear war. Max Holland and I write that, so there was a problem. 5.5 weeks, there's a struggle. I didn't go into all the details of the struggle over the usage of U-2, but let me just give you one example. In that earlier time frame, back in early September, when the CIA is saying, well, look, we need to have our flights over Cuba, the National Security Advisor in the White House, working for President Kennedy, sent a 3-part message to the CIA leadership and asked for a response within 2 hours. 2 hours. One of the questions, so it's White House sending a message to CIA, and this shows you the level of distrust. One of the questions they wanted an answer to was this: is there anyone there who's picking or urging these flights who wants to start an incident between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? In other words, is someone over there trying to start a war, trying to start, and the CIA leadership with all, look, John McCain, yeah, he was confused and all that, but he wasn't trying to start something. They were not, really the CIA leadership, I think understandably, was insulted. Like, what are we supposed to say to this question? You're asking us, are we trying to start something with the Soviets? The answer was, of course, no. All right, so the press reporting, the public opinion polls, it's all really looking great for President Kennedy. But Kennedy knew that members of Congress, Kennedy suspected that certain people in the press and certain members of Congress would start inquiring, okay, how come we were caught by surprise? The president and his people had been assuring the nation all the way. You could look at the Sunday morning TV talk shows, the Sunday morning before, I think it's a Tuesday, with the president's informed. Literally the day of the U-2 flight, there were administration personnel assuring the nation, look, the Soviets are not doing that. There are not strategic missiles there. It's okay. Well, it wasn't okay. So people began asking, like this, here's a member of Congress from New Jersey. Now, he didn't know why, but he knew enough to figure out, there was an intelligence problem. We're suddenly, we're saying there are no missiles in Cuba, and suddenly, why didn't we know sooner? He called it the worst intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. Another member of Congress, he was also a Republican from Ohio. I think he had some, I don't know how he got this information, but he got it exactly right. His name was William Minshaw. From September 5th until October 14th, we have no pictures of any missile activity in Soviet Cuba, and he wanted to know why. The answers that he was given, the Secretary of Defense McNamara responded to him, and he said, it's because they weren't doing anything. And McNamara and the administration kept saying, when they were asked, well, were we using U-2 flights over Cuba? The administration would say, and this was not honest, they would say, yes. In fact, we stepped up U-2 surveillance of Cuba. We didn't send 2 flights, we sent 4 flights. Well, I don't like to use the word lie, so let's use the word misleading or obfuscation. 4 peripheral flights could not really catch what was happening in the interior of Cuba. So this congressman somehow figured out there was some kind of a gap, but he didn't know why. Congressman Gerald Ford, who later became president, he didn't really figure out the photo gap thing, but I'll tell you, and again, it shows the level of suspicion in this country between Republicans and Democrats over security issues. Congressman Ford, who by then was sort of like the number 2 Republican in the House of Representatives, he thought that President Kennedy had known for weeks that there had been Soviet strategic missiles in Cuba. And he held that information back, and he timed the release of it so that the Democrats would do well in the congressional election. You know what, by the way, the Democrats did do quite well. You know, usually an off-year congressional, non-presidential election year with the congressional elections without a presidential election, the party out of power usually makes big gains, and the Republicans did not. So the Democrats did well. Ford thought Kennedy had timed this whole crisis, and there were other Republicans who thought that as well. There were other Democrats, there are other members of Congress. This is Senator Richard Russell and Senator John Stennis. They were very trusting of the CIA. So these are Democrats, but they're very trusting of John McCone at the CIA. They're not, I wouldn't say they're trusting of the Kennedy White House or the State Department, but very trusting of the CIA. Stennis presided over an actual, you know, those House members, they had suspicions, but they couldn't do anything about it. Stennis chaired a little subcommittee called Preparedness. Preparedness did a very in-depth investigation of the performance of intelligence agencies in the lead-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there was some rumors around about some kind of a photo gap. They looked into it. The conclusion of that report is no photo gap. So the so-called Preparedness Subcommittee investigation got it completely wrong. Stennis was a very smart guy, and he really spent time on this investigation. By the way, one of the other members you see here on the left of the Preparedness Subcommittee, Margaret Chase Smith, Senator Smith of Maine. I included that. I went and looked through Senator Smith's papers, and I'm intrigued simply because this is the first time that a woman legislator had been involved in any kind of a significant investigation of the CIA, and she was rather skeptical of John McCone, had voted against McCone's, here's McCone again. She had voted against his confirmation, but they totally missed the photograph story. So let me talk about this period of early 1960s, from winter, spring 1963, when this investigation is going on. Imagine yourself, you're the director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. It's the aftermath of the missile crisis. On the one hand, the president is looking very successful and heroic, and the public's impressed. On the other hand, there are these pesky members of Congress raising questions. There's the Stennis subcommittee doing an investigation. There are reporters asking questions. Remember, McCone had been saying privately for months, I think the Soviets are putting missiles into Cuba with warheads. After the crisis was over, McCone, he told, off the record, he told columnists and reporters, well, you know, I told them in August, September, I told them the Soviets were putting missiles. So word leaked out, and that word leaking out made John McCone look very good. Senator Keating looked good. Senator McKeating very publicly said, yeah, I told them so. They wouldn't listen. So in one sense, the Kennedy administration and President Kennedy himself was looking bad. McCone, Senator Keating, others had predicted this would happen. The president had been saying, no, it wouldn't happen, and then it did. So you might think that President Kennedy was a very happy guy in sort of winter, spring '63, but the reality is, and I've looked at notes of conversations, and I've listened to tape recordings, and he was angry over questions being raised about this, and very specifically, they did not look, the president was looking ahead to the 1964 presidential election. They did not want word to get out of this photograph. It was embarrassing. The reality is there was a messy struggle between White House and State Department on one side and CIA on the other side, and the president just found it embarrassing and messy. The president wanted to have a story that was out there of seamless success, highly professional management of the Cuba problem all the way from summer through the 13 days and beyond, just sort of perfect success. Well, and he knew that it wasn't. Now, the president himself, I've looked carefully at what he said of when he was asked once or twice, was there some kind of an intelligence gap, a photo gap? And he found sort of ways to kind of go, he's sort of saying no without actually lying. Others, like McNamara, just lied. McCone himself, I hate to say it because I have some real respect for him, but he certainly misled members of Congress. Kennedy was really angry at his director of Central Intelligence, McCone, because word was getting out. McCone was right. Kennedy had been wrong. I'm going to play you. I'm going to play you a recording of a conversation between President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy. The sound quality is not great, so let me just tell you. Robert Kennedy is alerting President Kennedy. He says, "Did you see the story by Mark Child?" Again, the sound quality is not great. You're not going to catch everything they say. But they're talking about a column in that morning's Washington Post by Mark Child, which basically says McCone and the CIA, they got it right in the lead up to the crisis. The White House got it wrong. Bobby tells JFK, CIA is pouring out the notion of CIA, McCone getting it right, the president getting it wrong. And you're going to hear the president say some critical things about John McCone. And if you don't quite catch some of the words, I'll summarize them for you in a bit. The tricky thing here is I'm going to skip the first minute of the conversation. There's some very crude language. There's one word in particular that's offensive. Right the instant after that offensive word is uttered, then they start talking about what I want to play for you. So let me see if I can get this just right. And if you do hear some offensive words, well, sorry.
Hello? Yeah. So, it got went to a party the other night. I don't know, sorry. Yeah, everything. I read it. It was always a different stuff. But, somebody we had a room in a John McCone's gonna quit sometime at a time and it suits them. You know that time? Yeah. It got, you know that, but what? Because they really pouring the stuff out of CIA. CIA. You see the article today? Yeah. Well, that was obviously based on what John told him. Look good. Yeah, but I didn't look ready. But I don't know, that's what he said. I wrote that story, you know, I guess. I'm sure because I get this thing. I want to do. But they put it out. I think, of course, you put it that he was only sending it into the CIA. But he said CIA pouring it out. Yeah. And I think he specified that on behalf of John McCone. And McCone was right. Well, that John McCone, that they're trying to make themselves look good. And that's where it's coming from. Yeah. He's a real man, John McCone. I wasn't exactly. He was useful at the time. Yeah, that's why he's really evaporated. But he can't get back to it. Of course, everything's normal now. That's the trouble with stupid himself. There's insane laws in that. But you got 1,500 terrorist guerrillas that are being trained over there.
So, to review, Bobby Kennedy says that McCone was useful at one time. Again, conservative Republican helps the Democratic president. JFK says, yeah, but boy, it's really evaporated. The president also said, he's a real bastard, that John McCone. He's a horse's ass. He's stupid. Everybody's on to him. I say to my students, I played this recording, I do a course on intelligence, I do a course on the presidency, and I say to them, never assume that a president likes and respects all the leading members of his administration. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The fact is, though, John McCone, ultimately, he towed the line. When he went before that Stennis subcommittee, the preparedness subcommittee, he denied that there was a photo gap. He denied that there were any significant problems in the lead up to the, he just denied it. Let me conclude by sort of speaking to two things. One is, why do we write this book? Since the Cuban Missile Crisis turned out well anyway, Does it really matter? Cuban Missile Crisis was a triumph. Does it matter? Here's why I would say, I think Max would agree with me, here's why we wrote the book. Look, we're interested, this is an aspect, this is a slice of the story relating to the Cuban Missile Crisis that had never really been told before. Some reporters and some historians had gotten some part of it and sort of speculated on it. It was Max Holland, my co-author. He's the one who found absolute sort of documentation at National Archives, CIA records about this. And then when he looked into it, and then I joined him in looking into it, what we discovered is the sheer amount of conflict. I say to my students, it can be naive to assume that the policymaking process goes smoothly. It's very often, I would say, usually some version of messy and conflictual. And so we're not writing a book to try to make President Kennedy look bad. If there's one way in which I think, in the aftermath of the crisis, one way in which I think he doesn't look good is his administration misled the Congress. There was a cover-up. Now, mind you, it wasn't a cover-up like Watergate. Watergate was a cover-up of criminal activity. This was not that. This was a cover-up of the fact that there had been some messiness and conflict, and of the fact that we really figured it out just in time. And this is the last thing I want to say. We really did figure out just in time that the Soviets were putting strategic missiles, nuclear armed, into Cuba. By alerting the president on the morning of October 16th, and in some sense, John McCain is a kind of a hero of that story. The CIA gave the president time to negotiate, to pressure Khrushchev to get their missiles out of Cuba. He could do that in a context where the missiles were not yet operational, as far as the president could see. And it was told that the medium-range missiles were in the process of soon becoming operational. As I say, the intermediate range, which could fly further, reach virtually all the U.S. Medium range could basically reach the southeast of the U.S., maybe up to close to Washington. Intermediate range could reach virtually all of the U.S. By finding the missiles when CIA did, the president could negotiate without the actual threat of operational missiles, some multiple number, aimed at the U.S. ready to fly. If John McCain had not gone to Kennedy and said, look, I cannot tell you what's happening in Cuba. You won't let us fly these U-2s across Cuba. I can't tell you. If McCain had done it, if there's been a delay of some more weeks, when the president, we can only assume at some point he would have learned of this, these missiles and warheads. The context would have been different. The context would have been the Soviets have some multiple number of medium and intermediate range missiles with the warheads on them ready to go. And so the pressure on the president, it seems to me and most scholars, would have been much, much greater. The crisis would have been more dangerous. The outcome also might have been less favorable. So there was a photo gap for 5.5 weeks. It's a bit shocking to have discovered this, but it's also important to note, ultimately, between the intelligence people and the White House people and State Department, we did discover the missiles, we, the U.S., just in time, and so that the president could negotiate in a more sort of acceptable environment. I'm sure there are other things that I meant to talk about, but I've already talked for, 40 minutes, so I'm going to stop with that, and then I'm happy to take any questions you might like to raise. Yes,
David, you said that during the 13 days you thought Kennedy was skillful and wise. I think I heard something in November at the time of the anniversary, which made me doubt that. Tell me if I understood it correctly. When the Russian ships were steaming towards Cuba with either more or larger missiles or the warheads, the U.S. Navy went out to meet them, and we were all worried there was going to be a naval battle. What I think I heard was that there was a submarine, a Russian submarine, and Khrushchev had given permission to 3 men on the submarine to fire torpedoes if they thought it was necessary, maybe even nuclear-tipped torpedoes. And at a certain point, 2 of these 3 officers on that Russian submarine said, now is the time. So Officer 1 says, now is the time? Officer 2 says now is the time. Officer 3, had he said now is the time, war would have begun, presumably, but he said, no, let's not do it, and he's regarded as a hero. Is this story true and significant?
I heard the reports of that story recently as well. Let me put it this way, it sounds plausible to me. I take that story to be one example that shows how close the United States and the Soviet Union came to nuclear war. There are other stories, there are some older stories, not that they're similar to that in the sense of, for example, we didn't understand during the crisis that the Soviets had these short-range missiles that were nuclear armed that were ready to go. If we had, Kennedy was being pushed to invade Cuba, and I think if Khrushchev had not agreed to what we wanted, I think Kennedy would have authorized bombing and invasion of Cuba within a couple of days. And if that had happened, very likely, and to our surprise, we would have faced nuclear short-range tactical missiles against our invading forces. And we didn't understand that that was a likelihood. So there were things going on that neither the president, well, there were things happening that the president and Khrushchev, in some cases, were not fully aware of and were not fully in control of. I don't know for a fact that the story is accurate, but it sounds plausible to me. I did hear about it. But, you know, you're an academic. We know with academics, we'll slug it out for decades figuring out if that story is correct or not. But it sounds like it probably is. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if you've ever heard a rumor or found any hint that Kennedy may have said to McCone, if you testify that there was a missile gap, we'll tell everybody it's your fault because you were on a month-long honeymoon during the midst of this issue.
They did not speak to each other that way, so I'm confident that that conversation didn't happen. But I'll say this: they were wary of one another. When they were together, they were very respectful and all that, but they were wary of one another. McCone did run it past the president late summer. He said, well, you know, I'm getting married, and the president congratulated and want to go on a honeymoon. Be 4 weeks in the south of France. And I think at that point, my only guess is Kennedy was like, gulp. But he didn't say no. He said, okay. Now, of course, they didn't know neither knew what was coming. But McCone ran it past the president. If I play further into that tape, you'll hear the president, he makes this very sarcastic reference. You know, damn honeymoon, 1 month honeymoon. But he had agreed to it. I find it shocking still, really, that McCone left town for a month. Like, I'm sorry, like, it's great you got married, but there were so many rumors flying in Washington, D.C. about Cuba. And again, we knew about these surface-to-air missiles, so for McCone to leave town, even with the president's technical approval, it just seems to me shocking. Yes.
Well, I'm curious about sort of McCone pouring it out,
Right.
and whether or not you think maybe some of that would have been related to, say, congressional appropriations from the House committees, because right at this time, presidents didn't essentially put together their budgets in a way that they do now for all the agencies. And if there was some trying to play both ends against the middle from that side.
Yes, from McCone's side. I think that's right. McCone, so much of what's said in the history books about the early to middle Cold War is that CIA could just have whatever it wanted from Congress. And I did a book on that subject and showed, well, that's not quite right. The CIA leaders, they worked hard to get, there were these tiny congressional appropriation subcommittees on the CIA, and those intelligence directors, Dulles and then McCone and a couple before them, they really wanted to keep those members of Congress, those powerful leaders, happy. So I think that's a part of the story. These members of Congress, after the missile crisis, said, did you know what was going on? And what McCone said is, well, I personally predicted it would happen. But McCone also had to report the larger intelligence community, so-called intelligence community. It's not really a community, but that's what they call it. You have a bunch of agencies that are struggling and sometimes in conflict. But he said, you know, we did do this estimate in September. I mean, it's amazing to think. September 19th, there's this formal estimate called a National Intelligence Estimate. They're saying the Soviets would not do that. At the very time where they were literally, had been for some weeks, deploying the missiles that will be on. But I think that that's right. McCone had to think about Congress, and so he would almost have to, unless he wanted to lie, he would have to say that he had predicted this because they wanted to know. So I think that's a good point. Yes?
Is there any indication that the Soviets had counterintelligence during the September 5th to October 14th to know that the U-2 flights had been paused and then started moving? I'm just curious about the timing of everything.
Yes, there's no. We now have a good record. We had a pretty good record then of ships going in and out. We just didn't know what was on the ship. So there's no indication that that photo gap, that pause in our surveillance, there's no indication that it affected their shipments in. It was an ongoing project, and it continued during that period, and even continued up through most of the so-called 13 days period. So, but they would have noticed, I'm sure of this, the Soviets would have noticed that the U-2 flights were not happening, and they would have been pleased about it. I think they would have been confused and surprised, but pleased about it, because they could tell when the flights went over. Any others? All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.